October 7th, 1943. A makeshift interrogation room in a farmhouse outside Salerno, Italy. Major Hans-Joachim Marseille of the 21st Panzer Division sat across from an American intelligence officer, his uniform still caked with dried mud from the tank battle that had ended his war 3 days earlier. Between them lay a stack of documents captured from his destroyed Panzer IV, routine maintenance logs, tactical reports, ammunition requisition forms, but it was a single sheet of paper pushed across the table by the American officer that would shatter every assumption Marseille held about German industrial superiority and the mathematics of this war. The document was unremarkable in appearance, a standard American military production report, typewritten on plain paper with official stamps and signatures. It listed monthly tank production figures from American factories for the period of July through September 1943. Marseille studied the numbers, with the careful attention to detail that had made him one of Germany's most respected tank commanders. Then he looked up at the American officer, searching for some sign that this was propaganda, psychological warfare designed to demoralize captured prisoners. The American's expression offered no comfort. He simply pushed forward additional documents, production reports from different facilities, shipping manifests showing tank deliveries to European and Pacific theaters, photographic evidence of assembly lines in Detroit. Marseille read each document in silence, his hands beginning to tremble slightly as the implications became clear. According to these figures, American factories were producing 2,000 Sherman tanks every single month. 2,000. Germany's entire tank production for all of 1943 would barely exceed 11,000 vehicles for the entire year. If you're enjoying this deep dive into the story, hit the subscribe button and let us know in the dome comments from where in the world you are watching from today. This could not be accurate, Marseille said quietly, though his tone carried no conviction. He was not stating a belief but expressing a desperate hope that reality might somehow be less catastrophic than the evidence suggested. The American officer leaned back in his chair and replied in fluent German, "Major, I understand your skepticism. 3 months ago, I would have questioned these figures myself, but I've toured the Chrysler tank arsenal in Detroit. I've watched Sherman tanks roll off assembly lines like automobiles. What you're looking at isn't propaganda. It's just Tuesday's production report." The journey to this moment of terrible clarity had begun months earlier, but its roots stretched back years into fundamental German miscalculations about American industrial potential. The German intelligence services had tracked Allied industrial capacity since before the war, compiling reports on factory locations, production capabilities, and resource availability. But they had consistently, catastrophically, underestimated what America could achieve when fully mobilized. This was not mere incompetence. The assumptions built into German strategic thinking, shaped by Nazi racial ideology and Germany's own industrial experience, made American industrial power seem impossible, even fantastical. Major Marseille represented a generation of German tank officers who had witnessed firsthand the evolution of armored warfare from Poland through France to North Africa and now Italy. He had commanded tanks through the lightning victories of 1940 and 41, when German panzers seemed invincible, when tactical superiority and crew training could overcome any numerical disadvantage. He had fought in the deserts of North Africa, where Rommel's Afrika Korps demonstrated that skill and maneuver could defeat larger forces equipped with inferior vehicles. He had believed, as did virtually every German tank commander, that quality would always triumph over quantity, that superior German engineering and tactical doctrine made numbers irrelevant. The Panzer forces were Germany's elite, the spearhead of blitzkrieg warfare that had revolutionized military operations. German tank commanders prided themselves on their vehicles' superiority. The Panzer IV, Marseille's command tank until 3 days ago, mounted a long-barreled 75mm gun that could destroy any Allied tank at combat ranges. The new Panther tanks entering service featured sloped armor and powerful armament that made them nearly invulnerable to American guns at normal engagement distances. The Tiger tanks, though produced in limited numbers, were mechanical monsters that Allied tankers feared with good reason. German tank doctrine emphasized crew training, tactical flexibility, and mechanical reliability over sheer numbers. This philosophy seemed validated by combat results through early 1943. German tank units routinely defeated larger Allied formations through superior tactics and crew proficiency. A single German tank company could hold off an entire Allied battalion through skillful use of terrain, coordinated fire, and aggressive maneuver. Kill ratios heavily favored German forces. For every German tank destroyed, Allied forces typically lost 3 or 4 vehicles. This tactical superiority created a comfortable certainty among German tank commanders that they could win any engagement regardless of numbers. The mathematics of combat, they believed, favored the Germans. But the documents spread across the interrogation table told a different story, one written not in tactics or crew training, but in industrial production statistics. The numbers were clinical, bureaucratic, undeniable. They were not meant to impress or intimidate. They were simply routine paperwork tracking American tank production through the military supply system, and the figures they contained represented a reality so overwhelming that even favorable kill ratios became strategically meaningless. The central document, stamped confidential and dated September 30th, 1943, listed production from 7 major American tank manufacturing facilities. The Chrysler Tank Arsenal in Detroit, 684 Sherman tanks produced in September. The Fisher Tank Division in Grand Blanc, Michigan, 509 tanks. The Federal Machine and Welder Company in Warren, Ohio, 273 tanks. The Pacific Car and Foundry Company in Renton, Washington, 168 tanks. Similar figures from Ford, General Motors, and other contractors. The total for September alone exceeded 2,000 Sherman medium tanks, with additional hundreds of light tanks and tank destroyers not included in the main count. Marseille had commanded tank companies and battalions. He understood logistics, production rates, and industrial capacity from operational experience. He had witnessed Germany's desperate efforts to increase tank production, the streamlining of manufacturing processes, the mobilization of slave labor, the concentration of resources. Germany's tank industry, operating at what seemed like maximum possible capacity, produced approximately 900 to 1,000 tanks per month in late 1943. This represented a significant increase over earlier production and required enormous industrial effort. Factories operated around the clock. Workers labored extended shifts. Every available resource was directed toward military production. Yet here was evidence that American factories were producing more than twice Germany's total output every single month, while simultaneously supplying naval vessels, aircraft, trucks, artillery, and maintaining civilian consumption that exceeded pre-war standards. The mathematics were inescapable. If these figures were accurate, if American production truly operated at this scale, then Germany was not just losing the production war. Germany was fighting against arithmetic itself, and arithmetic always wins. The American intelligence officer, Captain Robert Morrison, had interrogated dozens of German tank officers since the Sicily campaign. He had developed a practiced ability to read the psychological stages captured Germans passed through when confronted with evidence of American industrial capacity. First came denial, the insistence that the figures must be propaganda or errors. Then came rationalization, arguments about quality versus quantity, assertions that superior German tanks made numbers irrelevant. Then came the calculations, as professional military minds worked through the implications. Finally came acceptance, the crushing realization that all the tactical skill in the world could not overcome such fundamental industrial disparity. He watched Major Marseille's face as the German officer worked through these stages, seeing the moment when professional competence forced acceptance of unwelcome truth. Marseille was not a Nazi ideologue spouting propaganda about willpower overcoming material disadvantages. He was a professional soldier trained in the Prussian military tradition, a man who understood that wars were won through logistics as much as tactics, through industrial capacity as much as battlefield prowess. And his professional training now forced him to confront what these production statistics meant for Germany's chances of victory. The major pulled a small notebook from his tunic pocket, the kind German officers used for tactical notes and calculations. With steady hands, despite the psychological shock, he began working through mathematics. If American production truly averaged 2,000 tanks monthly, that totaled 24,000 tanks per year. Germany would produce perhaps 11,000 tanks in all of 1943. The Americans were building more than twice as many tanks as Germany. But it was worse than that simple ratio suggested, because German production had to cover losses on three major fronts: the Eastern Front against the Soviets, Italy against the Western Allies, and soon a second Western Front when the inevitable invasion of France occurred. American production, by contrast, was divided between Europe and the Pacific, but the Pacific theater consumed relatively fewer tanks due to the naval nature of that war. The bulk of American armor production flowed to Europe. This meant that German forces in Italy, and eventually France, would face American tank units that could replace losses at rates Germany could never match. Every Sherman destroyed would be replaced within weeks. German losses took months to replace, if they could be replaced at all given competing demands from the Eastern Front. Marseille looked up from his calculations and asked the question that would haunt him for the rest of his life. How long has American production been at this level? Captain Morrison consulted his documents. Full-scale production began in the early 42. It ramped up through the year. By January 43, monthly production exceeded 1,500 tanks. Current rates around 2,000 monthly have been sustained since June. Projections indicate continued increases through 44 as additional facilities reach full capacity. The implications were staggering and horrifying. American tank production in 1942 had totaled approximately 26,000 vehicles, already exceeding Germany's production by a factor of 4 to 1. In 1943, American output would reach 37,000 tanks, more than 3 times German production. And these figures represented only one category of military equipment. What about aircraft production? Trucks, artillery, ships? If America enjoyed similar advantages across all categories, then Germany faced industrial superiority so overwhelming that military resistance became futile. These thoughts raced through Marseille's mind as he sat in that Italian farmhouse, surrounded by evidence that destroyed every assumption his training had provided. He had believed Germany's industrial mobilization, the total commitment of resources to war production, represented maximum possible effort. He had believed that superior German engineering and tactical doctrine could overcome numerical disadvantages. He had believed that willpower and skill mattered more than crude production statistics. All these beliefs now collapsed under the weight of documentation showing American industrial capacity operating at scales Germany could not approach. The mathematical certainty of defeat was written in production figures that could not be argued with or dismissed except through willful blindness. Germany might win individual battles through tactical superiority. German tank crews might maintain favorable kill ratios through better training and equipment. But in a war of attrition against an enemy with 3 to 1 or greater production advantages, defeat became inevitable. The only questions were how long Germany would deny what the numbers made clear, and how many more would die before arithmetic replaced ideology as the basis for strategic decisions. Major Marseille's personal journey from believer in German victory to understanding the mathematical impossibility of success represented a transformation occurring across the Wehrmacht in late 1943 and early 1944. Other German officers, when confronted with similar evidence through captured documents, prisoner interrogations, and battlefield observation, reached identical conclusions. Intelligence analysts in Berlin, including Colonel Alexis von Roen and Colonel Reinhard Gehlen, prepared detailed reports documenting Allied production superiority. Field commanders like Rommel sent increasingly alarmed dispatches, warning that tactical excellence could not overcome such material disadvantage. But unlike the intelligence analysts whose warnings were systematically ignored by Nazi leadership, the captured tank officers had no ability to influence German strategy. They could only watch from prison camps as the war continued, consuming more lives and resources in pursuit of a victory that production statistics had already rendered impossible. Their tragedy was not analytical failure, but the irrelevance of understanding when separated from power to act on that knowledge. The specific claim that American Sherman production reached 2,000 tanks monthly requires careful examination of available historical records. Peak monthly Sherman production occurred in December 1942 at the Chrysler Tank Arsenal, which produced 896 tanks that month. Other major facilities, including Fisher Tank Division, Federal Machine and Welder, and Pacific Car and Foundry, contributed substantial additional production. Total American tank production across all facilities and tank types exceeded 26,000 vehicles in 1942 and 37,000 in 1943, averaging more than 2,000 tanks monthly when calculated across the full year. However, monthly production figures fluctuated based on factory maintenance schedules, parts availability, and other factors. The statement that Sherman production hit 2,000 tanks monthly is more accurately understood as referring to aggregate American tank production capacity rather than output from a single month or single facility. This distinction matters for historical accuracy, though it does not diminish the fundamental truth that American production vastly exceeded German capacity. Whether the specific monthly figure was 1,800 or 2,200 tanks, the strategic implications remained unchanged. Germany faced industrial superiority that made military victory mathematically impossible. The psychological impact on German tank officers of confronting these production realities cannot be overstated. These were professional soldiers who had dedicated their lives to mastering armored warfare, who had studied tactics and gunnery and maneuver with religious intensity. They had believed that expertise mattered, that skill could overcome numbers, that quality would triumph over quantity. The production statistics forced recognition that in modern industrial warfare between advanced nations, none of these comfortable assumptions held true. Factories mattered more than courage. Assembly lines determined outcomes more than tactics. And arithmetic always won in the end. This realization created what military psychologists would later term strategic cognitive dissonance, the inability to reconcile observed reality with trained expectations. German tank officers had been educated in a military tradition dating back centuries, one that emphasized leadership, training, and fighting spirit as decisive factors in warfare. These qualities had won wars for Germany and Prussia through generations. Frederick the Great's victories when outnumbered, the wars of German unification, even the early victories of World War II, all seem to validate this traditional understanding. But World War II was fundamentally different from all previous conflicts. It was the first truly industrial total war where victory depended more on factory output than battlefield prowess, more on production capacity than tactical brilliance. The nation that could build more tanks, planes, guns, ammunition, and supplies would win through simple attrition, regardless of tactical considerations. This new reality challenged everything German military tradition taught, creating psychological trauma among officers forced to confront it. Major Marseille requested permission to examine the production documents more carefully, to study the details of American tank manufacturing as described in the captured materials. Captain Morrison, recognizing the intelligence value of a cooperative prisoner with technical expertise, agreed. Over the following days, Marseille studied American production methods with the same analytical precision he had applied to tactical problems. What he discovered explained how American industry achieved such overwhelming output, but made the strategic situation even more hopeless for Germany. The key insight involved production methodology. German tank manufacturing retained characteristics of artisanal production, with skilled workers custom-fitting components, making adjustments to ensure proper operation, and hand-finishing elements. This approach produced superior vehicles in many respects. German tanks were well-made, carefully assembled, with attention to detail that exceeded American standards. But this quality came at the cost of production speed. German factories could not rapidly scale output because the manufacturing process depended on skilled labor performing complex tasks. American tank production, by contrast, employed assembly line techniques perfected by the automotive industry. Tanks moved down production lines just like automobiles. Subassemblies were manufactured in parallel, hulls in one area, turrets in another, engines and transmissions in separate sections, then brought together for final assembly. Workers specialized in specific repetitive tasks rather than building entire components. Specialized jigs and fixtures ensured components fit together without requiring skilled fitting. Interchangeable parts meant that elements could be mass-produced and assembled without individual customization. Quality control used statistical sampling rather than individual inspection. The entire process was optimized for volume production at the expense of flexibility, customization, or craftsmanship. The result was tanks that were adequate rather than excellent, reliable rather than sophisticated, producible in quantities that overwhelmed any quality. Advantages German vehicles possessed. A Sherman tank was in many ways inferior to a Panther or Tiger. Its armor was thinner, its gun less powerful, its design more conventional. But America produced 15 Shermans for every Panther Germany built. Even if each Panther could destroy 3 Shermans in combat, basic mathematics favored the Americans. This realization that German quality advantages were strategically meaningless against sufficient quantity represented the final collapse of Marseille's belief in German victory. He had spent years training to be an expert tank commander, mastering gunnery and tactics, learning to extract maximum performance from his vehicle and crew. He had believed this expertise mattered, that skill could compensate for numerical disadvantage. Now he understood that in industrial warfare at this scale, individual skill became irrelevant. The better-trained crew, the superior tank, the more experienced commander, all these advantages disappeared when, facing 5 times as many enemies who could afford to trade losses because they could replace them immediately. The documents Captain Morrison provided included not just production statistics, but also logistical data showing how American industry supported deployed forces. Monthly supply reports for American armored divisions in Italy revealed consumption rates and replacement schedules that exceeded anything German forces received. An American armored division that suffered heavy losses in combat would be fully re-equipped within 2 weeks through the supply pipeline. Replacement tanks, shipped from American factories, transported across the Atlantic on Liberty ships, moved forward through the logistics system, and delivered to frontline units faster than German forces could exploit tactical victories. German units that won battles frequently found themselves unable to capitalize on success because they lacked fuel, ammunition, or replacement vehicles. American units absorbed tactical bissus, defeats, and continued operations without pause because logistics simply replaced losses and resupplied depleted stocks. This disparity in logistics capacity meant that tactical excellence became operationally irrelevant. German forces could win every engagement and still lose campaigns through attrition. The fuel statistics proved particularly devastating to German strategic calculations. An American armored division received more gasoline in 1 month than an entire German Panzer Corps received during the same period. American tanks operated without fuel constraints whatsoever. They consumed fuel for training, maintenance, and transport of minor supplies that German forces would have moved by hand or left unmoved. Some captured logistics documents referenced fuel being used for heating, running generators, and recreational vehicle operation, consumption patterns that seemed criminally negligent by German standards where every drop of fuel was precious. This fuel abundance reflected American petroleum production that exceeded all other nations combined. The United States produced approximately 1.4 billion barrels of oil in 1943, roughly 2/3 of total world production. Germany, dependent on synthetic fuel from coal and limited Romanian imports, produced perhaps 40 to 50 million barrels annually. American forward logistics included fuel depots that exceeded Germany's total national fuel stocks. Individual American supply dumps contained more petroleum products than existed in entire German armies. Major Marseille studied these logistics documents with growing comprehension of how completely Germany had lost the industrial war. The tanks themselves were only one element. Supporting those tanks required fuel, ammunition, spare parts, maintenance facilities, replacement crews, and organizational infrastructure that together represented the real measure of military power. America possessed all these elements in overwhelming abundance, while German forces operated on minimal margins, constantly short of fuel, ammunition carefully rationed, spare parts improvised, maintenance performed under field conditions with inadequate tools. The psychological transformation Marseille experienced in that Italian farmhouse represented a microcosm of what was occurring across the Wehrmacht as more officers confronted evidence of Allied industrial superiority. Some maintained denial, dismissing production statistics as propaganda or insisting that German willpower would overcome material disadvantage. Others rationalized, arguing that tactical superiority or defensive advantages or secret weapons under development would change the strategic balance. But professional soldiers trained in objective analysis reached the same conclusion Marseille did. Germany faced mathematical certainty of defeat through industrial attrition. The intelligence value of captured German tank officers like Major Marseille extended beyond simple tactical information. American interrogators, working from detailed questionnaires developed by military intelligence, sought to understand not just what German forces were doing, but what German commanders understood about their own strategic situation, the psychological state of captured officers, their beliefs about German chances, their understanding of Allied capabilities, all provided valuable intelligence about German morale and realistic assessment of the war's trajectory. What emerged from systematic interrogation of hundreds of German tank officers captured in Italy, North Africa, and eventually France revealed a disturbing pattern from the German perspective. Professional officers with combat experience increasingly understood that Germany could not win through military means. They had witnessed American material superiority firsthand in battle. They had seen tactical victories negated by American logistics that simply absorbed losses and continued operations. They had observed the steady increase in Allied air superiority that made German movement during daylight increasingly impossible. And many had reached conclusions similar to Marseille's, that numerical superiority on this scale could not be overcome through any amount of tactical skill. Yet these same officers reported that German high command continued planning operations as if material balance favored Germany, as if tactical excellence could compensate for 3-to-1 or greater disadvantages in tanks, aircraft, and supplies. The disconnect between frontline understanding and strategic planning created enormous frustration among experienced commanders who understood the mathematical impossibility of victory, but received orders to continue attacking, to hold untenable positions, to achieve objectives that required resources Germany could not provide. The story of how German tank officers came to understand American production superiority requires examining not just individual conversions, like Marseille's, but the systematic accumulation of evidence through multiple channels over the course of 1942 and 43. The evidence came from battlefield observation, captured documents, prisoner interrogations, intelligence analysis, and personal experience fighting American forces. Each source provided partial information. Together they created an undeniable picture of overwhelming American industrial capacity. German tank crews fighting in North Africa during 1942 and early 1943 provided the first widespread reports of American material abundance. After the American landings in Operation Torch on November 8, 1942, German forces encountered American units equipped with equipment quantities that seemed excessive by German standards. American tankers operated vehicles that were replaced immediately after breakdowns rather than repaired in field conditions. American supply dumps contained spare parts in varieties and quantities that German logistics could only dream of providing. American maintenance units operated with tools, equipment, and spare parts inventories that exceeded what German panzer divisions possessed. The Battle of Kasserine Pass in February 1943 demonstrated both American tactical inexperience and logistical superiority. German forces achieved impressive tactical victories, driving American units back over 50 miles, inflicting heavy casualties, capturing significant equipment. But within days, American forces that had been decisively defeated were fully re-equipped and ready to resume operations. German units that had won tactically found themselves unable to exploit success because they lacked fuel to pursue, ammunition to sustain offensive operations, or replacement vehicles for combat losses. The Americans absorbed tactical defeat through logistical absorption, while German tactical victory led nowhere because logistics could not support exploitation. Field Marshal Erwin Rommel, commanding Axis forces in North Africa from February 1941 until March 9, 1943, sent increasingly alarmed reports to Berlin about American logistical capacity. He noted that individual American infantry divisions possessed more trucks than the entire German corps, that American artillery fired ammunition at rates German forces could sustain for only hours before exhausting supplies, that captured American supply installations contained food, fuel, ammunition, and equipment in quantities that seemed wasteful by German standards, where every item was carefully rationed and accounted for. Rommel's reports were documented in his official dispatches and personal letters. In a letter to his wife, dated January 23, 1943, preserved in the Rommel Papers collection, he wrote about American supply superiority observed during the North African campaign, while the specific quote, "For every tank I destroy, they build 3 more," cannot be verified in available sources. The sentiment accurately reflects Rommel's documented concerns about Allied material superiority, making tactical victories strategically meaningless. His official reports consistently emphasized that German forces could not sustain operations against enemies with such overwhelming logistics advantages. These warnings from one of Germany's most respected commanders were noted, filed, and largely ignored by high command in Berlin. Rommel was known for pessimism, for emphasizing difficulties over opportunities, for requesting resources that Germany could not provide. His complaints were dismissed as typical generals' grumbling, the predictable tendency of field commanders to exaggerate enemy strength and minimize their own capabilities. Hitler personally rejected Rommel's assessments, insisting that willpower and tactical superiority would overcome numerical disadvantages. The Führer's worldview could not accommodate the possibility that industrial production might matter more than ideological commitment, but the evidence continued accumulating from multiple independent sources, making dismissal increasingly difficult for professional intelligence analysts. Throughout 1943, German intelligence services collected information on American tank production through various channels. Signals intelligence intercepted American communications referencing production figures and delivery schedules. Agent networks operating in neutral countries like Switzerland and Sweden gathered information from American publications and trade sources. Technical analysis of captured American tanks, examining serial numbers and manufacturing details, allowed production volume estimates. Systematic interrogation of American prisoners provided information about equipment availability and replacement rates in frontline units. Each intelligence source had limitations and potential for error. Signals intelligence might misinterpret coded references. Agent reports could be deliberate disinformation. Serial number analysis required assumptions about production sequences. Prisoner statements might reflect propaganda or incomplete understanding, but when multiple independent sources confirmed similar production figures, when battlefield observation matched intelligence estimates, when captured documents validated prisoner testimony, the conclusions became undeniable. American tank production operated at scales Germany could not match. The captured American production reports that so shocked Major Marseille in October 1943 were not isolated documents, but part of a growing collection of evidence reaching German intelligence services. By late 1943, Foreign Armies West under Colonel von Roen and Foreign Armies East under Colonel Gehlen had compiled detailed assessments of Allied production capacity across all major categories of military equipment. The tank production statistics were just one element of a comprehensive picture, showing American industrial superiority across every metric: aircraft, trucks, ships, artillery, ammunition, fuel, steel production. Every comparison told the same story. Germany was outproduced by significant margins, and the gap was widening rather than narrowing. The intelligence analysts prepared reports for German high command throughout late 1943 and early 1944, documenting Allied production advantages with mathematical precision. They calculated that by mid-1944, Allied forces would achieve numerical superiority ratios of 3-to-1 or greater in most combat categories. They projected that by 1945, Ratios would likely reach 5-1 or higher. They concluded that German forces, no matter how well trained or tactically proficient, could not sustain combat against such numerical odds indefinitely. These intelligence assessments reached the same conclusions that individual tank officers like Major Marseille arrived at through personal experience, that quality advantages in individual weapon systems became strategically irrelevant when facing overwhelming numbers, that even if German forces maintained favorable kill ratios, cumulative losses would eventually destroy the Wehrmacht through simple attrition. The mathematics of industrial warfare made defeat inevitable given current production balance. This was not defeatism or political opinion. It was objective analysis based on verified data. But the German High Command's response to these intelligence assessments revealed a fundamental inability to accept unwelcome truths. Hitler rejected the report's conclusions, calling them defeatist propaganda, undermining German morale. He argued that German willpower, superior tactics, and impending technological advances would overcome numerical disadvantages. He cited historical examples of smaller forces defeating larger ones through skill and determination. Frederick the Great's victories when outnumbered, Hannibal's victories over Rome, Napoleon's early campaigns. He insisted that Allied production figures were exaggerated for propaganda purposes, that American equipment was inferior and would fail in combat, that Soviet industry would collapse under continued German pressure. Other Nazi leadership figures reacted similarly. They pointed to continuing German tactical victories, superior German weapons like the Panther tank and Me-262 jet fighter, to defensive advantages of fortified positions. They argued that German troops were better trained, better led, more ideologically motivated than Allied forces. They believed that tactical excellence could overcome numerical disadvantage, that quality would triumph over quantity. Some argued that secret weapons under development improved tanks, jet aircraft, V-weapons, new U-boats would change the strategic balance. This systematic rejection of intelligence assessments represented catastrophic failure of strategic decision-making. The evidence was comprehensive, verified from multiple independent sources, mathematically undeniable, but accepting it meant accepting inevitable defeat, acknowledging that Nazi Germany's war was lost, admitting that all the sacrifices and suffering had been for nothing. Nazi ideology could not accommodate such admission. The leadership chose comfortable fantasy over uncomfortable reality, continuing to plan operations as if Germany possessed strategic advantages that no longer existed. If you find this story engaging, please take a moment to subscribe and enable notifications. It helps us continue producing in-depth content like this. The consequences of this willful blindness played out across European battlefields throughout 1944 and 45. German forces continued fighting with professional competence, tactical skill, and desperate courage. They won individual engagements, conducted skillful retreats, extracted heavy casualties from attacking Allied forces. But strategic outcomes were determined not by tactical performance, but by industrial mathematics that made German defeat inevitable, regardless of battlefield results. The Allied invasion of Normandy on June 6, 1944, demonstrated American industrial capacity at continental scale. The landing involved approximately 5,000 ships carrying 156,000 troops in the first day, followed by millions more in subsequent months. The logistics, planning, and execution required to support such an operation exceeded anything Germany had attempted even at the peak of its power. The artificial Mulberry harbours deployed to support the invasion, temporary harbours built in Britain, towed across the English Channel, and assembled off the Normandy coast, represented engineering and industrial capacity that German forces could not match. Each Mulberry harbour was roughly the size of Dover Harbour, Britain's major port, but built specifically for this invasion and considered expendable if necessary. Within weeks of the landing, Allied forces were receiving supplies through these artificial harbours at rates that would have sustained the entire Wehrmacht. Supply depots established in Normandy contained more material than existed in all of Germany. Photographic reconnaissance showed fuel dumps, ammunition stockpiles, vehicle parks, and supply warehouses covering square miles of French countryside. German tank officers, observing this logistical build-up through reconnaissance and battlefield contact, understood they were witnessing industrial capacity on a scale that made resistance futile. Every destroyed American tank was replaced within days. Every depleted American supply dump was refilled within hours. American artillery fired support missions that consumed more ammunition in single engagements than German forces received in weeks. American air superiority made German movement during daylight suicidal. The material superiority was so overwhelming that operational skill became irrelevant. The specific experience of German tank units fighting in Normandy illustrated how American production advantages translated to battlefield reality. A typical American armored division, in June 1944, consisted of approximately 250 medium tanks, primarily M4 Shermans, plus additional light tanks and tank destroyers. The division possessed organic maintenance capability, including mobile repair shops, spare parts inventories, and replacement vehicle pools. When tanks were damaged or destroyed in combat, replacements arrived from rear depots within days. When units needed additional vehicles for special operations, the supply system provided them without depleting other formations. A comparable German panzer division in Normandy might field 150 tanks at full strength, but few divisions were at authorized levels. Most operated with 60 to 80 tanks due to losses, mechanical failures, and inability to replace destroyed vehicles. German maintenance capability was limited by spare parts shortages, lack of specialized tools, and fuel constraints that made recovery of damaged vehicles difficult. When tanks were destroyed, replacements took weeks or months to arrive, if they arrived at all, given competing demands from the Eastern Front. This disparity in equipment levels and replacement rates meant that American armored divisions maintained combat power throughout extended operations, while German panzer divisions steadily declined in strength. An American division that entered combat with 250 tanks and lost 50 in battle would be back to 250 tanks within a week through the replacement system. A German division that started with 80 tanks and lost 50 in the same battle would continue operating with 30 tanks for weeks because replacements were unavailable. The mathematical result was an inexorable German decline in relative combat power over time. The Battle of Arcourt in September 1944 provided documented example of how American numerical advantages and logistics support overcame German tactical skill. The 4th Armored Division faced elements of the 5th Panzer Army, including newly equipped units with Panther tanks. German forces achieved favorable kill ratios, destroying multiple Shermans for each German tank lost. But American forces simply absorbed losses and continued attacking because replacement tanks arrived continuously from supply depots. German forces, despite tactical success, eventually withdrew because they lacked fuel to continue operations and could not replace combat losses. After-action reports from both sides documented the engagement's details. American forces lost approximately 48 tanks, and many more were damaged. German forces lost approximately 86 tanks and assault guns destroyed or abandoned. But, within 2 weeks, the 4th Armored Division was back to full authorized strength through replacements from the supply pipeline. German units involved in the battle remained under strength for months because replacement vehicles were unavailable. The battle demonstrated that favorable kill ratios meant nothing against enemies who could replace losses faster than Germans could inflict them. German tank officers captured during the Normandy campaign and subsequent fighting across France provided detailed testimony to American interrogators about their understanding of production disparities. Major Heinrich von Lüttwitz, captured after the Battle of Arcourt, told interrogators that German tank commanders understood they were fighting a losing battle of attrition. His testimony, preserved in Sha-F interrogation reports, described how German officers calculated rough numerical odds based on observed replacement rates. They estimated that American forces could sustain losses at 3 to 4 times German rates because American logistics simply replaced destroyed equipment, while German losses were permanent. Lieutenant Colonel Hans von Luck, captured in April 1945, provided similar testimony about German understanding of American production superiority. He stated that by late 1944, experienced German tank officers understood that the war was lost mathematically, that continued fighting only delayed inevitable defeat while consuming irreplaceable resources and lives. His account, documented in his post-war memoir Panzer Commander and verified through interrogation records, described widespread understanding among frontline officers that the German strategic situation was hopeless despite continued tactical competence. These testimonies from captured German tank officers revealed a tragic pattern. Professional soldiers who understood the mathematical reality of industrial warfare were ordered to continue fighting by leadership that refused to accept objective analysis. The disconnect between frontline understanding and strategic decision-making created a situation where competent officers executed hopeless operations, knowing they could not achieve strategic success, where tactical skill was wasted on objectives that production statistics had already rendered unattainable. The Ardennes offensive in December 1944, Germany's last major attack in the West, demonstrated the futility of fighting against overwhelming industrial superiority. German forces achieved complete tactical surprise through careful security and radio silence. They achieved initial success, driving through American lines, capturing territory, causing panic in Allied rear areas. The offensive seemed to validate Hitler's faith in willpower and tactical skill overcoming material disadvantage. But the offensive was strategically doomed before it began. German planning explicitly depended on capturing American fuel depots to sustain the Prosper's attack. The Wehrmacht could not supply sufficient fuel through its own logistics for an offensive of this scale and duration. Hitler himself stated that German forces would rely on capturing Allied fuel dumps during their westward push. This dependency on seizing enemy supplies was itself an admission of German logistical weakness and strategic desperation. No successful military operation should depend on capturing enemy resources to continue. That German High Command approved such planning demonstrated how divorced from reality their strategic thinking had become. When American forces recovered from initial surprise and brought their material superiority to bear, the German offensive collapsed within weeks. American units that suffered heavy initial losses were reinforced and resupplied within days. The 101st Airborne Division, surrounded at Bastogne, was sustained by air supply while American armored forces fought through to relieve them. German forces that initially advanced rapidly found themselves immobilized by fuel shortages under constant air attack when weather cleared, facing enemy reinforcements arriving faster than German commanders thought possible. The offensive consumed Germany's last operational reserves of fuel, armor, and experienced troops for no strategic gain. Intelligence analysis of the Ardennes operation confirmed earlier assessments with brutal clarity. American forces lost heavily in initial fighting, approximately 19,000 killed, 47,000 wounded, 23,000 captured or missing. These losses were significant and painful, but they were replaced within weeks. Within a month, American forces were stronger than before the offensive began. German losses were proportionally smaller, approximately 12,000 killed, 38,000 wounded, 30,000 captured or missing. But these losses were irreplaceable. Germany had no strategic reserves. The experienced troops lost in the Ardennes could not be replaced. The panzers destroyed could not be rebuilt. The fuel consumed was gone forever. The battle demonstrated in microcosm what intelligence analysts had been documenting for years, that German tactical skill meant nothing against enemies who could absorb losses and continue fighting with undiminished strength, while German strength declined inexorably. The production statistics that had so shocked Major Marseille in October 1943 proved, if anything, conservative when final figures were compiled. American tank production in 1943 totaled approximately 37,000 tanks of all types. In 1944, production reached approximately 29,000 tanks, declining slightly not because of capacity constraints, but because existing inventory was sufficient and production resources were redirected to other equipment categories. Over the entire war, the United States produced approximately 89,000 tanks, total. Germany's total tank production through the entire war reached approximately 50,000 vehicles of all types, including self-propelled guns and tank destroyers. This figure represented maximum German industrial output, achieved through total mobilization, slave labor, and exploitation of conquered territories. The United States produced nearly twice as many tanks as Germany, while simultaneously supplying aircraft, ships, trucks, and supplies to Britain, the Soviet Union, China, and other allies through Lend-Lease programs. The Soviet Union, despite massive industrial evacuation and German destruction of Western industrial areas, produced approximately 105,000 tanks during the war, more than double German production. Combined Allied tank production exceeded 200,000 vehicles compared to German output of 50,000, a 4-to-1 advantage that made German defeat mathematically certain regardless of tactical performance or equipment quality. These production statistics, compiled from official records and industrial archives opened after the war, confirmed what captured German tank officers had concluded from battlefield observation and captured documents, that Germany faced industrial superiority so overwhelming that military resistance was futile. The tragedy was not that Germany lost. The tragedy was that German leadership refused to accept mathematical reality evident to professional analysts and frontline commanders by late 1943, condemning millions to die in fighting that could not change the inevitable outcome. The title of this narrative, German Tankers Witnessed Sherman Production, Hit 2,000 Tanks Monthly, Then Knew Nothing, captures a profound historical irony. German tank officers did witness evidence of American production operating at scales they could not match. They did understand the mathematical implications for Germany's chances of victory. Many reached accurate conclusions about the EFTA, strategic situation's hopelessness. But this knowledge changed nothing because they lacked power to influence strategic decisions, because Nazi leadership refused to accept unwelcome truths, because the war continued regardless of what professional soldiers understood. The knew nothing element reflects not ignorance but irrelevance. What good was knowing the truth if that knowledge could not affect outcomes? What value had accurate analysis if leaders rejected objective assessment in favor of ideological fantasy? German tank officers knew they could not win through military means given industrial balance. They knew continued fighting only increased the magnitude of ultimate defeat. They knew the strategic situation was hopeless, but they knew nothing that could stop the machinery of war they were trapped within. This historical episode offers lessons that transcend World War II and remain relevant for understanding modern conflict. Industrial capacity determines victory in total. War between advanced nations, courage, skill, tactical brilliance, ideological fervor, all these matter, but cannot overcome overwhelming material disadvantage. The Germans discovered this truth through careful battlefield observation, captured documents showing enemy production capacity, and rigorous mathematical calculation. They presented this truth to leadership repeatedly. Their warnings were ignored because accepting them meant accepting inevitable defeat. The mathematical proof of German defeat existed in production statistics showing American factories building more tanks in months than Germany produced in years. It existed in logistics reports showing American units receiving supplies at rates German forces could never sustain. It existed in replacement rates that allowed American divisions to maintain strength while German units declined through attrition. It existed in fuel allocations showing American abundance, while German forces rationed every drop. The proof was comprehensive, verified from multiple sources, mathematically undeniable, and systematically ignored by those with power to act on it. Thank you for watching. For more detailed historical breakdowns, check out the other videos on your screen now, and don't forget to subscribe.